So in developing a theology of Christian pacifism, or a theology of Christian nonviolence, which is basically seeking to understand Jesus' teachings to see if they are pacific or non-pacific, and if they are pacific, to see what their implications are. In developing a theology of Christian pacifism or Christian nonviolence, we have to be concerned with the very same basic phenomena that any theology, whether Pacific or non-Pacific, whether Christian, Buddhist, or what have you, has to be concerned with. The phenomena of what kind of God is God, if God exists, and what does he expect of man. But underlying all these, there is a quirk in the consciousness of man, and most especially perhaps in the religious consciousness of man, that we call religious self-deception. Basically, it's this business of lying to oneself. The seriousness of the problem is, as we have seen, that if one lies to oneself at the point where he is alone with God, where no one can correct him but himself, where only he knows that he is lying to himself, the radical problem here is that then you can proceed logically, get conclusions, make the conclusions operational, even institutionalize them. And by George, what you've got is nothing other than illusion, madness, if you will, unreality, being the basis for the use of human time and the organization and the social organization of humanity. It is imperative that one not lie to oneself about what one sees as true, about what is self-evident. However, this business of religious self-deception, or as Sartre calls it, bad faith, is a very subtle and a very complex process. To show you how subtle and how complex it is, what I'd like to do is I'd like to offer you a series of definitions on religious self-deception, on lying to yourself about what is self-evident to you as a religious entity. Now let me begin with this definition here. The self-deceiver is one who resolutely refuses to look at his beliefs because he knows very well that he won't see what he wants to see. The self-deceiver is one who resolutely refuses to look at his beliefs because he knows very well that he won't see what he wants to see. Now, a couple of years ago, a few years ago now, I guess, I remember reading a poll that ran something like this: that approximately 90% of the Catholics in the United States had never read the New Testament on any occasion. They had read bits and pieces of it, heard bits and pieces of it, but they had never read the entire New Testament. Why not? Well, there are all kinds of reasons that can be offered, but let me at least suggest, in terms of this definition here, that to resolutely refuse to look at the foundation document of your beliefs could be motivated by knowing that one will not see what one wants to see in the New Testament. And therefore, the easiest way out of this is simply not to look at the New Testament, not to reflect on it, not to discuss it. All right, let's take a look at another example of self-deception. Remember, when one deceives himself, no one can correct him. It comes close to being what? It comes close to being the unpardonable sin. If you look in the Gospel of John, where it talks about the sin against the Holy Spirit, the footnote in the Jerusalem Bible talks about it as being the sin against the Spirit of truth. If you lie to yourself about what is self-evident, You will go on logically following that course, living it. Only you can correct it. But after a certain point, the process becomes that you believe what you believe as to being true, what you initially knew you were lying to yourself about. You don't want to get out any longer. And therefore, the only thing that's necessary for forgiveness, according to the teachings of Jesus, that is to ask God to forgive. One never does, because one believes that he's being truthful when he knows that he's being dishonest. Complicated process. Another definition to kind of elucidate it, bring it out. Self-deception is to intentionally persuade oneself to believe what one knows is not the truth. Note the element of intentionality. There is always intentionality in self-deception. It is not totally an unconscious or subconscious process. You persuade yourself to believe what you know is not the truth. The key element here is that you are intentionally doing it. There may come a time in a future date where you no longer realize that you're lying to yourself and therefore continue living a lie that you believe to be the truth. But at the beginning, you knew that you were simply lying to yourself. It is an intentional process. For example, how much persuasion has to go in, how much telling oneself that it's true has to go in to the process of making oneself believe that Jesus said that it was legitimate to spray human beings with flamethrowers. I don't know. But it seems to me to be awfully difficult. That it would require an enormous amount of intentionality, of personal persuasion, to reach the point of saying Jesus found it legitimate to spray other human beings with the flames from flamethrowers. How about this definition? The self-deceiver is one who lies with sincerity, who convinces himself of what he even then knows is not so. The self-deceiver is one who lies with sincerity, who convinces himself of what he even then knows is not so. He's lying. He's misplacing is. He's saying something is that is not. He's convincing himself of what at that very moment he knows is not. He's in the process of creating illusion for himself. He's in the process of setting up an unreality, an unreal world in which to live, to act, to teach, to communicate, to use his human time. But it is an intentional process. It's a lie that he's going to pass off as truth to himself and others. Or this. The self-deceiver is one for whom there is nothing to be seen, because he knows very well there is something unbearably distressing to be seen. How many of us refuse to look at our beliefs, our values, our motivations, our sense of what ought to be, our sense of why we're doing what we're doing, and most importantly, why we're not doing what we would like to do? How many of us resolutely refuse to look at that and say, there's nothing to be seen, everything's just fine? How many of us do that because we know that if we looked at our motivations, if we looked at our beliefs, if we compared our beliefs with the foundation document, the New Testament, if we looked at why we're doing what we're doing and why we're not doing what we want to do, there would be something unbearably distressing to be seen. Everything wouldn't be hunky-dory. Everything wouldn't be just grand. And so, the self-deceiver is someone that, because he really knows the inconsistencies and the conflicts in his value system, in his belief system, in his behavioral system, in his religious ideology, if you will, he simply ignores it. Or, how about this? Self-deception is making oneself believe or forget something of critical importance which points overwhelmingly to the conclusions opposite the ones adopted by the self-deceiver. Self-deception is making oneself believe or forget something of critical importance which points overwhelmingly to the conclusions opposite to the one adopted by the deceiver. Now, the definition goes along with the ones that we've been dealing with up to this moment in time. It adds a little dimension here that what is believed, making oneself believe, or what is forgotten, is an element of critical importance. Not just a piece of a scintilla of evidence, if you will, but something central to the case. For example, how many people who have glorified and justified, and I mean glorified and not just justified, the use of violence by Christians on behalf of Christians and Christian institutions, how many people have ignored the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus' teaching about love of enemy, the very symbol of the cross itself, which is someone dying, forgiving his enemies, and not slaughtering them. To forget something of critical importance which points overwhelmingly to conclusions opposite to the ones adopted by the self-deceiver. What does Jesus have to say about the use of love versus the use of violence in human affairs? Did Jesus have anything to say on the subject of love versus violence? Why is it that Christians, historically and in our present day, are so sure of what the Christian position is on those issues, of which there is very little said in the New Testament, and are so unsure on those issues in which there is statement after statement after statement, for example, on the problem of violence versus love, made in the New Testament? Once again, to constantly ignore the theme of violence versus love in the New Testament, to constantly ignore the reality of the symbolism of the cross, what Jesus has to say about love of enemies, the Sermon on the Mount, and on, to constantly ignore or forget these matters of critical ethical importance in the teaching of Jesus could possibly be self-deception. Or, and finally, the self-deceiver persuades himself to believe contrary to the evidence in order to evade somehow unpleasant and unwanted truths. He has already seen the truths to which the evidence points. It is a way of attempting to evade distress or to maximize satisfaction. The self-deceiver knows that there are truths that he is evading. He's replacing these truths with his own pseudo-truths, his own lies. He creates a faith on those lies that he calls truths, hence a bad faith. Why does he do it? To evade distress or to maximize satisfaction. Consider this. Suppose one were to come across an idea, a theme, a reality, let's call it, of the teaching of Jesus that was inconsistent with some fundamental tenet or way of behavior of one's social or personal life. Let's say, suppose one were a Christian And for his entire Christian life into his adulthood, he found that he believed that it was perfectly legitimate for a Christian to be lustful. That a Christian could sleep with every man, woman, and animal that he came across. And then all of a sudden, he comes across those passages in the New Testament where Jesus talks about the problem of lustfulness. What is that person to do? I've raised to you the same problem. Suppose someone is brought through a Christianity that has been teaching the legitimacy of violence, hate, fear, anger, and not just the legitimacy on a personal level, but the legitimacy when these things become massive, when murder becomes mass murder, when hate becomes mass hate, hatred of whole nations and people, when anger becomes mass anger, when fear becomes total. Suppose one believes all that to be Christian, and then comes across those New Testament passages where Jesus talks about love of enemy, the Sermon on the Mount, about the ultimate sacrifice being not killing but giving one's life. What does he do then? What does he do then? The real danger is that he can turn to a self-deception. He can make believe the passages aren't there. Why? To evade the distress of having to change your life, or to continue in some satisfaction, either his lifestyle or his lustfulness. Evading distress or maximizing satisfaction are two of the prime motives why people lie to themselves. Prescinding for the moment from specific Christian religious dimensions of the problem of self-deception, there is one particular kind of ultimate question that self-deception relates to in a rather radical way, a rather harsh way. Whether one is talking about Buddhism or Christianity or Judaism or atheism, the problem of self-deception, as it relates to the ultimate problem of death, borders on the overwhelming. Death is an enigma. You and I simply have no choice in being here. Saying it another way, we come into existence out of nothingness. We were nothing. We come from nothingness. We go through some process of becoming. Some process. We are clearly not now what we were when we were 10. And the question of death, at this point where death enters in, the question is, does this process of becoming that goes from nothingness to death, does this process of becoming end in eternal death, or does it end in eternal life? 1 second after we die, 1 second after we die, are we existing or are we not existing? Are we or aren't we? This is an enormous problem. perhaps too much for any individual, or certainly too much for most individuals to face. The possibility that each one of us comes out of nothingness and returns to nothingness forever is real. It's one of two possible options. The other option being, of course, that we come out of nothingness, go through a process of becoming, and possibly that ends in eternal existence of some kind. However, eternal oblivion, eternal annihilation, is a very real possibility. As we sit here now, or stand here now, as we think, we realize that 100 years ago this very minute, billions of people inhabited the earth. They were thinking, breathing, seeing, talking precisely as we are now. They had their worries, their fears, their hopes, their joys. And where are they now? Where are they now? And that was 100 years ago this very moment. What about 500 years ago? Where are the millions that were on the face of the earth then? 1,000 years ago? Where are all those people who were in Asia and China, Russia? What about Africa and South America and North America? Where are they? Are they gone like the ant that we stepped on this afternoon forever? Will they ever be again? You see, it is difficult, it seems to me, to be serious about either philosophy or theology unless one is going to give a certain amount of serious attention in terms of making death not only an intellectual question, but a problem in his own existence, a problem to be solved somehow. First of all, in terms of philosophy, death is at the root of Western philosophy. Plato refers to philosophy as nothing other than the art of dying. Cicero says philosophy is the consideration of death. Montaigne, to philosophize is to learn to die. Epictetus, let others study case law and practice syllogisms. You learn to die. Schopenhauer, death is the inspiring genius of philosophy, without which man would hardly ever philosophize. St. Augustine, everything about us, good as well as evil, is uncertain. But as soon as man is born, it must at once be said, he cannot escape death. There is ultimately no stopping it. And he who inquires into death is solely interested in what truly takes place. He is not interested in textbook specimens of logic. In the 20th century, Heidegger talks about the fact that human language, the very language that we use about death, sows the impression that death only operates in the third person. He dies, she dies, they die, but I don't die. In his analysis of ordinary life, which he calls a marketplace mentality, he says people are constantly reassuring each other about death. That is, that death will not happen to them. Quoting Heidegger, there is no other way of expressing more extremely that something is of ultimate seriousness than to say it is a matter of life and death. Death is the absolute crisis. Yet, the marketplace mentality involves a crass optimism of simply ignoring death. as if knowledge of it were granted us purposelessly, as if dying were some sort of painful episode that occasionally still happened, something best not to be talked about, at least not in public. The problem is precisely this. If we are to ignore death, if death is not an ultimate question, an ultimate problem to us, then we are ignoring a primary consideration, a primary reality in the human condition that makes a difference in determining all other kinds of realities. Let me give you an example, to use an analogy. To ignore death is this. It's like a man going up a down escalator. The escalator is in fact coming down. The man thinks he's going up. He makes believe he's going up. All the time he's involved with massive self-deception. He knows he's going down, but he keeps telling himself that he's going up. He has other people with him, all doing the same thing. And then each one of them is involved in self-deception. Each one knows he's going down, each one knows he's in fact going down, and talks as if he was going up. What do? They then create values, attitudes, beliefs, institution, ways of relating to each other based on the illusion that they are going up when in fact they're going down. If one is going to break through self-deception at some basic level, one has to simply turn around on the escalator and see that he's going down, and then create his lifestyle, his consciousness, his values, his attitudes, his beliefs, his way of relating to other people in light of one of the prime realities of his human existence, the fact of his own mortality and their own mortality. To refuse to turn around and to look at where one is headed is to guarantee self-deception, is to guarantee that whatever logic is used will wind up in creating institutions and personal ways of acting that are simply in tune with a fantasy of an unreality and have nothing to do with logic. Have nothing to do with the logic that would follow from a true perception, or a truer perception, of the universe that we happen to inhabit. An essential ingredient to avoid self-deception is to face one's own death. It may be, as Lucretia says about death, "Thou shalt sleep and never wake again." It may be, as a writer for the Boston Globe a few months before he died wrote, "Every stance is a posture, every face a pose. We are all victims of mirrors and mothers' hopes. There is no purpose in it all, there is no master plan. Alcoholism, like accountancy or medicine, is only somebody to be, as are the priesthood, the military, and the law. When it is over, the dark diceman comes to visit us all. Death is at the end of every street. No matter how you hedge or how you scramble, the greatest effort in the least is rewarded with gravel in the face. You won't be back, so don't kid yourself, and neither will I." That is one possibility: eternal and everlasting oblivion, forever. That's hell. The other possibility is eternal existence forever. When Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, he who believes in me shall not die. He is saying, I have the keys to eternal existence. I have the way that will lead past death, past eternal oblivion, past eternal annihilation for you, your loved ones, and mankind. Jesus' teaching, Jesus' revelation is a revelation. The gospel is good news about the fact that evil and death can be overcome.